Welcome back, everyone. In this part, we're going to continue to work on our news section. Particularly, we're going to talk about the header that I had mentioned that we're going to show here at the top of our news table view. So in our header, we want to be able to show the title for whatever, context we're looking at, top stories or otherwise. And later on, when we talk about building the stock details screen, we're also going to reuse this component, and we optionally want to show a add to watch list button here if the stock we're viewing is not a part of the user's watch list already. So that all said, let's build this out. Not a whole lot to it, but we'll dive into it anyways. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is create an actual view in here. I'm going to go ahead and create it right here. We'll say new file. It's going to be a Cocoa Touch class. It's going to be a subclass of a UI table header footer view. So let's see if I can find it. There we are. And we're going to call this a news header view. Try to name things as descriptive as you possibly can. Go ahead and create it and get started by deleting this unnecessary commented code. The first thing we want in here is going to be an identifier. This is what we are going to use to actually register this particular header. We can also put a preferred height in here, which is going to be the height that we'll use for the header. We'll say 70. We hard-coded this in the table in the previous video, but we'll start to use this since this is going to be a reusable component. Now, inside of every view, we're going to create a view model as promised, and this view model will help us configure our particular view. So in this case, we want a title, and then we also want should it show add button, which is going to be a Boolean. And now let's talk about actually building out the rest of this particular view. So we first and foremost in here want to always override the initializer. So we'll say init. We are going to say init with a frame, if I can find it. Let's see. Init with a reuse identifier is actually what I'm looking for. So we're going to say init. We're going to pass this in for the reuse identifier. Make sure you bring in the required initializer. See if we can find it, that required with a coder. That one right there, just saw it, there we go. We're going to want to lay out our subviews, so 99% of times you'll want this. And some views have a prepare for reuse if the view is intended to be reused. Generally, table view cells and other headers get reused. So now that we have this view model thing here, we want to have a function on here so others can configure this view with said view model. So here we're going to say public func configure, and I'm going to go ahead and say configure with a view model of type view model. Keep in mind this is local scope, so it'll always be this guy right here. Now, what do we actually want to show inside of this particular view? We want two things. We want to have a label, which will serve as the title, of course, in the header. And the other thing we're going to want is a button. So before we get to the button, let's create this label here. We're going to want to probably increase the font size on it. You can, play around with the sizing and the weight and all that good stuff. Maybe we'll try 32 here and see how we like it. And let's see, the next thing we're going to want is a button. And this button by default is going to be hidden. And we're only going to show it if our view model tells us that we want to show it. Now I'm going to give this button a title, and the title is going to be a plus sign and watch list. So basically this button is going to add the given stock to a watch list. Now you could make this button even configurable with the view model as well, but since we only need it for this purpose, we can get away with doing that. We're going to set the background color here to be a system blue. We're going to set the title color here to be a white for normal. And we're just going to pretty this up a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and give it a corner radius of maybe 6. We'll also make sure the layer does in fact mask to bounds, aka we'll see that corner. Maybe we'll even bump this to 8 here. And let's go ahead and start adding these as subviews. So in the initializer here, we definitely want to go ahead and say content view, add subview, and we want to add the label as well as add the button. Now, one thing you might observe, this is kind of redundant. Why can't we just add all our subviews in one shot? Well, we can. We're going to add an extension so we can do exactly that. So we're going to open up our extensions file that we previously created, and we're going to add, like I mentioned, some more extensions to make our life easier just in general in terms of the amount of code that we're going to have to write. So we're going to extend the UI view class, and we're going to add a function called add subviews, which will be plural. And this is going to take in views, and we're going to use something called a variadic parameter, which is this ... business, and it tells us that we can basically pass in multiple UI view classes. So all we're going to do here is say views, and on the views we're going to say for each, and this is going to basically pass us the view that we're looking at. We're going to say add sub view singular $0, which will be that particular view. And now what we can do as a result of adding this handy dandy extension, we can just, instead of doing a single view at a time, we can say add sub views, and I can chain these together like so. It reduces the amount of code you have to write on the color side, so I always think that's a win. So now that we've got that there, in the configure function, it's pretty simple. We'll say label text is going to be view model dot, and this will be title, and we're going to say the button is hidden is going to be view model, and it's going to be should show add button. So if this is set to true, we want it to not be hidden, so we'll take the inverse of that. So if should show is set to true, is hidden is false. So cool, so now that we've got done this stuff done, in the reuse prepare function that gets called, we're going to say text is going to be nil. Now what else do we want to do? Well, we never added an action to our button, so I'm going to say button add target is going to be self. And when we tap on the button, again, we're going to use that delegate pattern to proxy the call to whoever the delegate is at that point. So we'll go ahead and create this button action here. It's going to be an Objective-C private selector. And we'll create a delegate in a moment, but we'll just say call delegate. And let's see what else we want to do. Most importantly, we want to lay out our views. So first up, let's do the label. We'll say that it is CG rect. We'll say maybe 14 from the left, 0 from the top. Width can be content view dot width, subtracting 28, and the height can simply be content view heights, just like that. And that should be good for our label. And we'll do the button momentarily, but let's just do that for now. And let me actually go and hook this up to our news controller to make sure we can actually now see our title. So we're going to go ahead and jump into our controllers and go to our news controller. To use this new header, we first want to register it. So we're going to register the news header.self for a header footer reusable identifier, which is the ID off of this guy. Now down here, instead of hard coding 70 for the height, we're going to say return.preferred height, just like that. And we want to dequeue this actual header, so we'll go ahead and say guard-let header is going to be table view. We're going to dequeue a reusable header footer view for the given identifier, and we're going to try to cast this particular view as the header that we have created. The reason we're going to cast it here is because we need to call that configure function on it. So I'm going to go ahead and say return nil there, and in this case we'll return the header. And here we're going to say header, and we're going to say configure with the given view model, which takes in a title and a boolean. Now the title is pretty simple. We have type on ourself, so we'll say self.type.title, and keep in mind that type refers to the enum that we created way up here, and the title is either top stories or the given symbol uppercased. And then this guy's going to be nil for the actual showing of the add button. We'll set this to true in a moment to make sure it's actually showing up, but for now this is pretty good. Let's go ahead and give it a run, and let's see if we're starting to see our header. All right, we should have one section by default, and boom, we definitely see our header here. So one thing that I'm not a fan of is the way this color is looking. So what you could do is you could get rid of the background color of the header, or you can set it. It's a little optional, but at least we're getting our top stories here looking pretty swell. So let's go ahead and work on that add button. So I'm going to set this to true, and then we'll also tweak the color while we're at it. So let's jump into the header view, And the background color here, we aren't actually even setting. So I'm going to say content view dot background color, and we're going to say this is a secondary system background. Let's go ahead and give that a run, and let's see if that's looking any better. All right, much better. Okay, now I'm happy. Now it looks good. We don't see our add button just quite yet, but we're going to fix that. So we said that shows to true. So we've definitely set is hidden to be false, but we need to give this guy a frame first. So I'm going to go ahead and say button size to fit, which will auto size the button per the appropriate sizes. And then we're going to assign the frame. Of course, you can use constraints for this as well. Very subjective, both accomplish the same thing. So let's go ahead and line break all this stuff to make it look a little nicer. Here, we're just going to say button.height. I want this to be a little wider than the actual desired or the minimum width. So I'm going to say plus 8 here, not 9. So we have 4 points on each side. The X is going to be content view dot width minus button dot width, subtracting perhaps 4 for the buffer, but a little bit more for just the inset. So maybe we'll say 14. And the Y is going to be the content view height, subtracting the button height divided by 2. In other words, we're vertically centering the actual button. If I did those calculations quickly, feel free to pause just to check that math, and let's go ahead and give this a run and check my own math. So hopefully we see a button here, which in fact we do. There is our plus watch list button. We could probably move it inwards a little bit more, a little subjective, but let's go ahead and do that. Let's move it in maybe to 16. But I'll leave that as is. Before we run it again, let's hook this up to an actual delegate. So what we want to do is leverage that same delegate pattern we did in the results controller. So I'm going to come all the way up here and create a protocol, which is going to be suffixed with delegate, and we're going to extend any object. And this is going to be news header view did tap add button, and we're going to pass in a reference of the header view just like that. It's pretty common standard for delegates. We're going to want a weak var on here, which is going to be called delegate of type our delegates. And now down here, when we click on the button, we can say delegates, go ahead and call that function passing in self. So in our case, on the watch list, when we see top stories, we can't add top stories to our watch list, so we're going to set this hidden to false, or rather to showing it to false, so it's hidden. But when we click into a particular symbol in stock, we're going to conditionally show this if the given stock is a part of our watch list. So let's go back to our watch list controller, and we are going to say, rather our news controller, and we are going to say false for our shows button here. So we'll go ahead and say false right there. And then you can also go ahead and line break this so it looks a little cleaner. Also, I shorthanded how we initialize this view model. So if you're confused for any reason, basically this is equivalent to doing the header view dot view model. So I just did it with the init since it's a little shorthanded, but it's a little cleaner to read in this case since the dot view model is a little verbose. So there you have it. That is our header. We're starting to look a whole lot nicer. Let me go ahead and run this, make sure that add button disappears. The next thing we need to do is start to look at our data, because we need data before we can bring in any cells here. And actually, even before doing that, we're going to want to have an array on here, which I'll create very quickly right now. Let me just move this enum all the way up. And we're going to have an array on here, basically, which is going to represent our stories that we're looking at in the news panel. So we're going to mark this as properties, and there's going to be a private var array called stories, and I'm just going to stick a string in here, but of course this will have a dedicated model. So that's all I've got for you guys today. Thanks for sticking around. I'll see you guys in the next part.